Hello everyone, today is day 7 of our 30-day watercolor flower series, and today we are painting a rose. I like to start roses in the very center, doing 2 or 3 small half circles, and then I layer half circles or moon shapes around and around, smaller to bigger. So as I'm coming out and layering these moon shapes around each other, I'm going to start getting bigger and wider and thicker. Now for this rose, we're looking at it from the side just a little bit. We can still see the top center. So I'm going to make more petals and bigger petals along the bottom of the rose that's closest to us so that the center starts to angle away from us and look higher and off to the left. That will make it look like the rose is pointed away from us. And then the rose has a little bit of green leaves at the base that are called the sepal, and then a long straight stem. And then here I am putting in a little rosebud. I'm doing some of the outer greenery and then adding the rose inside. Then I'm doing a little bit of greenery on that stem, just some tiny little leaves. And then I'm adding some texture and bumps to the stem of the rose, kind of representing the thorns and the little knobs that roses can have on the stem. And then I'm adding leaves that have a really rough and jagged edge. To mix up this beautiful pink color I want to use for the rose, I'm mixing up some yellow with Opera Rose to get a pinky orange color. And I don't want it to be very highly pigmented. I want it to be a little bit watery at this stage. So I first start by doing a dot in the center and 3 tiny little half circle moon shapes around it. Then I get a little bit more paint on my brush and I start very slowly making thin moon shapes around that center. For these shapes, I'm using the very tip of my brush with light pressure, but then as I come farther out and the petals are getting longer and wider, I'm using more pressure with more of the body of my brush. I'm leaving some white space between the petals so that we can see some distinction, but if some of the petals touch, that's totally fine. My main goal with the shape of these is really to get them to look like a moon, where either end is very pointy and then the middle of it is more full. Now you can see here I have a really awkward grouping. So I wet my brush, and because everything is still wet, I'm able to remove that really weird petal that I had on the top that just wasn't working. So if you can try to work with everything still wet, you can save some of those awkward spots. So now I've got it to where it looks a lot better. And as I'm coming out, I'm starting to make the petals fuller in the center. So think about when you're looking at a rose, how the center of the rose is really bunched. It's like a lot of lines, they're really close together. And then as you come out, the petals start to open up, and it's more of a half circle than a moon shape. So just make sure you have also a variation of some of the thinner strokes, some of the bigger strokes, especially with some of those really thin strokes in the back, so that it really does look like those petals are farther away and more hidden. Now, while everything is still wet, we're going to pick up some more of the Opera Rose with less water so that the pigment is stronger. And we are going to tap that at the bottom of these petals. So where the petals are having the inner curve of the moon shape, closest to the center, that's where we're going to tap in this color. Because if you think about the petals coming out, the other end is also going down into the flower, because we're thinking of the flower as a cone, though the end of the petals will go down into the cone, and so it will have a little bit of shadow. So we're going to place some of the color at that curve, and then you can use some water and a clean brush to kind of diffuse the color into the petal a little bit, but don't be afraid of some of the harsher shadow lines because it will really give everything a lot of depth. Now, if you can believe it, the rose part of our painting is already finished. You can go back and add more punchy color, but I wanted to keep the rose nice and soft. So now we're going to do the greenery. I'm picking up some sap green and mixing it with the green I already had on my palette. I tap it to the rose to get a little bit of blending because I really like that diffused look where they connect. And then I did my slightly curved stem. We've talked about this before in some of the other videos, that anytime you can have some curvature, it gives the idea of movement, which really helps your paintings. And then I'm just lightly adding in some of the texture on the stem for the bumps or the thorns. Now I've brought this stem up here with this little bit of greenery to start on the rosebud. So I like to do little strips of green and keep the center open for the rose color. So I'm going to let that dry and then I will put it in later. Then I'm going to bring another little stem off the main stem to do our first leaf. So I like to paint the leaf like I do my regular typical leaves, the two-stroke method, leaving some white space in the middle for the vein. And then I go on the edges and I kind of bring little points off the side with the very tip of my brush and light pressure. This gives it that classic jagged edge that rose leaves have. Now I'm doing a big curvy stem to create another leaf, using the end of that stem to guide me into creating the shape of the leaf, bringing the two-stroke method down, and then adding the jagged texture afterward. Now, if you consider how much weight was on the right side with the rosebud and the other leaf, I needed to make the left side a little bit more equal in balance. So adding another smaller leaf that is bunched up next to this really larger leaf helps balance everything out. And then I bring some of the balance down towards the bottom of the stem by adding a couple of areas of texture and bumps for thorns again. Now, while the greenery is still wet, we're going to pick up some alizarin crimson and we're actually going to add it to our greenery. Now, because red and green are opposite each other on the color wheel, when you add them to each other, you make a muted version of that color. So red adds a lot of depth and shadow and muted green colors when added to it. It makes a more realistic and moody color palette, especially for roses. Now everything is finished, but we're not going to forget about our little rosebud. So I'm mixing up some of that pinky, yellow, orange color for the rose, and I'm just tapping it into that white space we left for the rosebud. A little bit goes a long way. Just placing that in there, and we are finished. Now we get to add the rose to our day 7 spot on our watercolor guide. I can't believe it has already been a full week in our 30-day watercolor series, but the rose is just so classic. I had to make sure it was part of the guide, and I really love how this soft pinky color turned out. Thank you so much for being here today while we painted day 7, the rose. I will see you all tomorrow for day 8. Bye.